Have you ever looked around your city, maybe your own neighborhood even, and just felt this weird sense of deja vu? Like so many buildings, so many homes today, they just sort of blend together. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Have we somehow lost a unique architectural identity, especially here in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a feeling I think a lot of us have, even if we don't quite put it into words as we move through our cities. So today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. We're looking at the really significant challenges facing architectural design across the Arab region, and we're leaning quite heavily on the insights from Hassan Redouan's book, Architecture in Context, Designing in the Middle East. It's a really compelling read.
Okay, so our mission today is to really get a handle on how we got here, right? To
Right.
unpack the actual impact these design trends have on, our daily lives. And maybe most importantly, to explore the paths that Redwan suggests for, well, reigniting an architecture that genuinely speaks to its place and its people.
Exactly. The book really sets the stage. It highlights that contemporary architecture in the Middle East and North Africa is, and I'm quoting here, at a critical crossroads with regard to the limits of global and local design practices.
Right.
It's this real tension between the global pull and the local identity.
Okay, let's start right there. We all notice it, this repetition, this feeling that designs are often maybe a bit uninspired, frankly. What does Redwine see as the main drivers behind this kind of copy-paste thing we see happening in architecture?
Well, what's really striking is a huge theme in the book is the massive influence of the commercial market, specifically developers. Radwain points directly to the pressure of sheer consumerist architecture that satisfies only the demands of competitive developers. Think about market rules, monotonous building materials, maybe regulations, and definitely fast production.
Right, so when speed and standardization become the main goal, you naturally end up with things looking,
Mhm.
well, the same.
Precisely. And that's why you see these large, often global architecture and engineering firms producing this huge range of buildings. But they often prioritize that efficiency, that repetition, maybe above everything else.
So it's not just about being efficient, it's almost like a visual mimicry. Designs just get replicated everywhere.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Radween is actually quite critical. He talks about the current ironic trends of copying traditional stylistic forms verbatim and pasting them on imported modern facades.
Hmm.
And he says this leads directly to pastiche and shallowness.
Pastiche.
Yeah,
Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean in this context?
sure. Pastiche isn't just simple copying. It's more like borrowing heavily from different styles, often traditional ones, but doing it in a way that feels, well, unoriginal, superficial. It lacks a real understanding or depth of the original context. It just becomes decoration. He also mentions projects that might use something like, say, Islamic geometry in their plan, but it becomes an oversimplification of Middle Eastern architecture.
Ah, okay. So it looks the part, but doesn't really connect.
Exactly. He calls it a theme park approach.
Hmm.
Making something look glamorous or exotic on the surface, but without any real authentic connection or meaning behind it.
That phrase, theme park approach, that really hits home. It suggests something quite superficial. But what about the deeper stuff, like systemic factors? What role does, say, education play, or building codes, or even big investors? How do they fit into this cycle?
That's a really critical question. And the book argues quite strongly that young designers and architects are not equipped with knowledge about how these crafts work. And this isn't just about, technical drawing skills. It's a deeper lack of understanding. The contextual knowledge that historically was just embedded in Middle Eastern architecture.
So, knowledge gap.
A big one. Radouin really emphasizes the need for major investment in education and in cultivating an understanding of the contextual knowledge. He also traces some of this back to economic shifts. After independence in many countries, the design process itself became weaker, the exception. He points to the Gulf states, which started booming thanks to the boost provided to their economy by the exploitation of oil.
Right, the oil boom. So that brought massive development, but maybe it had a kind of double-edged effect. It accelerated this trend of looking outwards for design.
Exactly that. With all this new wealth, patrons often brought in, star architects, these famous international architects, to design iconic buildings.
Mm.
These are meant to be symbols of power, of wealth. But in doing that, it often led to more standardization of construction methods and competition
And
processes.
the result?
Well, the result is that many Gulf cityscapes, while they're incredibly impressive in scale, they can start to look quite similar to each other. It echoes that theme park project feeling again, designed perhaps more for the spectacle than for genuine local integration or human scale.
Okay, so we've talked about the visual side, the monotony, but what's the actual human cost? How does all this repetition, this importing of styles, affect something really fundamental like our privacy? Or even just our physical comfort in our own homes?
Well, if you connect the dots, this shift has often created a fundamental clash. Redwine calls it extrovert architecture versus introverted social culture.
Hmm.
He highlights this really stark contrast. You have the introverted local family, and then these extrovert buildings, often designed by foreign architects who aren't necessarily considering the local context, the social environment.
So they just don't align.
They really don't. Imagine a culture that traditionally values private family spaces suddenly living in buildings with huge glass facades, very exposed. The book notes that this often results in homes where users still focus on the interior, sometimes even leading to a sheer neglect of facades. And this directly causes privacy issues, obviously, but also this lack of aesthetic balance between the inside and the outside.
Wow. It sounds like a complete departure from, centuries of traditional wisdom, where
Oh,
privacy wasn't just added on, it was built into the very bones of the home.
absolutely. Radwin explains how Middle Eastern architecture has been largely introverted historically. It was designed to preserve that core of privacy within a kind of protective shell. Think about traditional designs, like in old Medinas. They often use blind facades, walls with very few windows facing the street, specifically to retain privacy and optimize thermal comfort.
And we're losing those elements in modern design.
We often are. We see this unfortunate absence of really effective traditional features, like the inner courtyard, for instance. That wasn't just a nice garden. It was, as Redwine puts it, essentially an ideal environmental solution for conceiving a protected space within the hot climate of the Middle East. It gave privacy, light, ventilation.
And things like wind catchers.
Yes. The beggar, the wind catcher or wind tower, an incredibly clever integrated environmental solution that offers thermal comfort through architectural forms. These elements were masters of passive climate control, of social privacy, and they're often just missing today, leaving us with buildings that don't work as well or feel as comfortable in their specific place.
Okay, given all these challenges, the identity crisis, the privacy issues, this feeling of disconnect, it's easy to feel a bit, well, pessimistic. But the book does offer hope, right? It suggests ways to bring back a more responsive architecture. So, how do we start turning this around? How can we learn from those very traditions we just talked about?
Yeah, definitely. The book has some really valuable ideas here. Traditional Islamic architecture, for example, is full of lessons. The courtyard, like we said, isn't just about privacy. It's an environmentally responsive building form in itself, creating its own little microclimate.
And what about mashrabiyat, those intricate screens?
Exactly. Mashrabiyat, those beautiful wooden lattices you see on windows or balconies,
Oh.
they were used masterfully, the book explains, for trickling light via a geometric arabesque treatment. So they let in filtered light and air, kept things private, and helped with cooling, all without complex machinery. Rudon also really stresses that basic things like proper orientation are crucial to achieving an ideal layout for the building envelope.
Orientation meaning just how the building is positioned.
Simply how it's angled towards the sun, towards the prevailing winds, it can make a huge difference to the internal temperature and comfort levels.
That's fascinating. It feels so holistic. So, taking that idea further, can modern architects actually integrate these traditional concepts? Not just make things look traditional, but work with current technology for better airflow, better comfort, especially in our hot climate. How do we bridge that gap?
Yes, absolutely. And this brings up a really important point about working together across disciplines. How can architects collaborate better with, say, mechanical engineers right from the start? Redwine strongly advocates for passive energy versus mechanical air conditioning. He shows how natural air can flow through a well-designed passive building, cutting energy use dramatically compared to what he calls oil-reliant architecture that just blasts AC all the time.
So, designing with nature, not against it.
Precisely. The book really champions designing with nature, understanding how to use natural elements to capture cool air, insulate walls from external heat, optimize the use of water, sustain an internal green spot, basically adapting to the climate, not fighting it. And this isn't just theory. He calls for more research into contemporary passive solutions.
Hmm.
And interestingly, he points out that the traditional dense urban geometry, those compact old city layouts, actually proved its thermal efficiency because the buildings shade each other. That high shade density reduces the overall heat gain. It's a powerful lesson from the past that's incredibly relevant for building sustainably today.
Okay, we've covered the visual repetition, the impact on privacy and comfort. Let's shift gears slightly to another common complaint many of us feel. Why do new apartments, new houses, often feel so much smaller than, say, our grandparents' homes. How have market forces affected the actual size, the lived experience of our homes?
Yeah, it's a really noticeable thing. And what's insightful in the book is how these big market shifts and what Ray Doyne calls the housing crisis in many places have paradoxically led to a weakening of the design process itself. He puts it quite bluntly. The current out-of-scale architecture is devoid of any human sense. He draws this sharp contrast with older traditional design that was often more human-scaled, focused on the people living there.
So there's a real difference between like older family homes and today's mass housing.
A huge difference. He describes much of today's mass social housing as quantitative housing, lacking minimum living conditions. It really feels like a trade-off was made. Quantity over quality, often sacrificing genuine livability.
And it's not just about the square meters, right? It affects how families live, how they interact, whether they have personal space. So if smaller spaces are just the reality now in cities, how can smart design step in? How can it make these smaller homes feel more functional, more open, more human?
This is exactly where intelligent design becomes so critical. The book really emphasizes that space ought to be challenged with the sense of place, with its human essence. It's not just about four walls and a roof, it's about the experience within those walls.
How do you achieve that in a small space?
Redwine introduces some really useful concepts for arranging space, even small spaces, like prioritization. This means really understanding human needs in a space and prioritizing them. Asking, what's truly essential here? How does the design serve that first? Then there's connectability. This is about envisaging different modes of connection between parts of spaces. Not just corridors, but fostering social flow, making different areas feel linked. And maybe most interesting is polycentrality, together with multifunctionality.
Okay, break that down. Polycentrality.
It means a space isn't just for one single purpose. It can have multiple centers of activity. Think of a living area that can easily shift from being a quiet reading corner to a place for family dinner, or a kids' play zone. This multifunctionality adds layers of value, makes the space much more adaptable and useful.
So it's about being clever with the layout.
Exactly. Creating a smart configurational strategy, as he calls it. A really intelligent design, where even a smaller shell needs to be designed according to certain aesthetic rules, but without jeopardizing the raison d'etre of architecture.
Making sure the building serves a fundamental human purpose, rather than just being an empty shell.
Wow. This whole deep dive into Hassan Radoin's work, it leaves you with a really powerful thought, doesn't it? As we look around us, at the cities we live in, the buildings going up, we really have to ask, do we just want to live in a building, a structure, or do we actually want to live in a home? Something that tells our story, reflects our culture, meets our real human needs.
That's the core challenge the book throws down. It pushes us to think that what we design shouldn't just be a dictated program of functions or distorted fancy form. That's not enough. Instead, architecture should be an articulation of a sociospatial dimension.
Meaning it needs to be deeply connected to our social lives, our cultural context. It's about creating, as Redwine puts it, an idyllic bond between the perceived and the conceived. Bridging that gap between how we imagine a space should feel and function and how we actually experience it, making sure architecture really resonates with, well, the human spirit.
So thinking about the future, for the next generation of engineers, of architects, the people who will literally build our future cities, what's the big takeaway message from Rezoidwan? What should they carry forward?
I think the core message is a really strong call to action. Redwine warns against young designers, seeking only to pursue the path of fame, that pursuit of iconic status. He urges them instead to focus on building a real architectural legacy, something that has more to do with a lasting, sustainable imprint than just another senseless skyscraper in the void of a desert.
So less focus on the individual star architect.
And more focus on the community. He argues very forcefully that the architect's role should be gradually reestablished so that the design is conceived with the community on the ground.
Yeah.
Not designed in some distant ivory tower office and then just parachuting designs into other regions of the world, as he puts it. That ivory tower image really paints a picture of disconnection.
Right. Designing with people, not just for them.
Exactly. It comes down to valuing local know-how. That incredible wisdom embedded in traditional ways of building and understanding, crucially, that technology without culture is what prompted empty forms that have no spirit and no sense of belonging.
That's a powerful place to end, a reminder that our buildings, they should be more than just concrete and glass. They should serve people, tell our stories, reflect the culture of their place, and ultimately they need to prioritize that human experience, not just the bottom line of the market. So let me turn it back to you, our listener. What stands out to you as the most critical takeaway from today's deep dive?